Historical fiction is one of the genres that I really wish I'd read more of. Every time I get the opportunity to read a work of historical fiction, I love it. I love going into worlds in different time periods, whether we're talking about more contemporary historical fiction or older works. I always enjoy it. And yet, there are so many more books that I haven't read in this genre than the ones that I have. And honestly, having so many wonderful works of historical fiction on my shelf, that's part of the joy of reading. You never really finish. It's a journey. You're always learning, you're always growing, you're reading more. But sometimes you're encountering or confronted with a genre where you realize, man, there's a lot more that I need to read compared to what I've read. I've only really scratched the surface. And I guess this is true with every genre, but for me, this is particularly true with historical fiction. Nonetheless, I did want to share today some of my favorite historical fiction novels, as well as some of the great classics that I'm most excited to read based on recommendations of people I appreciate. If I'm missing your favorite, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. I have a lot to learn in this genre, and I'm really excited to see where we go. So the first one, probably my favorite work of contemporary historical fiction, is The Book Thief. This one was published in 2005, so within my lifetime. It's a relatively recent work. The basic premise is it's narrated by Death, which I think is a super interesting narrative voice choice. Whenever this as a kid, I remember thinking that was so creative. I'm sure this has been done before, maybe in other ways, but it's really done tastefully in The Book Thief. And the story is about a young girl navigating Nazi Germany with the help of books. She loves books so much that she steals them as a kind of act of hope and resistance. And it's touching, it's heartbreaking. It's not a book that I will recommend lightly. It has themes of obviously World War II and death and humanity, and being narrated by Death makes it super memorable. Being set in World War II makes it challenging, and blending that tragedy with the beauty and hope that really is exposed, really is detailed in this touching tale. It will bring tears to your eyes, and it will teach you a little bit about the era in which it was written, which is one of the great aspects of historical fiction. We want to learn more about every period that we're reading in. So The Book Thief is my first choice for a wonderful work of historical fiction. I think this is also a good one to mention. It has both literary fiction and young adult aspects to it, so it's not going to be challenging to read, but it's really wonderful. Second one on my list here is one that I also read in high school. This is A Thousand Splendid Suns. This was published in 2007, so another contemporary-ish work in the last 25 years. Two Afghani women from different generations, they build a friendship and a relationship in the midst of war and destruction and oppression and cultural as well as war-based challenges. And so this book is really, really touching. The author, Khaled Hosseini, also wrote another book called The Kite Runner and another one called And the Mountains Echoed. Those are all wonderful works worth reading. In particular, I enjoyed A Thousand Splendid Suns. I think probably because it was the first one I read. It's the one that stayed with me the most over the years. It spans a large period of time as well. So you get like decades of Afghani history. And this to me was just super insightful. And it led me to read a lot more, starting with Wikipedia, going on to encyclopedias and history books about Afghanistan. And it's really a really great entry point, but the story itself is really, really wonderful. And I think it did inspire a lot of other readers to take a similar journey to me and explore modern Afghanistan and the past of Afghanistan. I think we think of Afghanistan as this war-torn country, but it's really a brilliant quasi-Persian or partially Persian, partially Farsi, which is a branch of Persia, but essentially it's been its own nation for so many years, for thousands of years. It's been kind of the at the edge of an empire, of the Persian Empire in this case, and the Iranian Empire, but it's never really been that. And so it has its own history, it has its own people, it has its own ethnic groups and conflicts and historical challenges, advantages and disadvantages in terms of the military side, in terms of the human side. There's really beautiful elements of the life that is exposed in this book, and really tragic and challenging elements of it as well. I highly recommend checking out A Thousand Splendid Suns. You'll get deep insight into ordinary lives in extraordinary historical events, as will you with, of course, The Book Thief as well. So both of these books are wonderful places to start. That one was also a massive bestseller in our millennium. A third work of historical fiction is one I read very recently, A Gentleman in Moscow. I read this with my book club in June. It was one of our June reads. So in the book club every month we have a adult historical fiction book, or could be just general fiction. Doesn't have to be historical fiction. It could be both of them have been historical fiction the last couple of months. We read a work of classic fiction as well as a children's work, and we try to delve deep into the human experience through both of these vehicles. But reading A Gentleman in Moscow was really just such a wonderful insight into human experience when everything is protracted. The main character is an aristocrat who's sentenced, and basically for the rest of his life, to live in house arrest in this massive hotel, in the Metropole Hotel in downtown Moscow. And so everyone thought that he would just go crazy or something bad would happen. But he lives decades in this hotel, and he creates meaningful relationships with the denizens of the hotel that in a previous life they would have just been waiters, and he would have been the aristocrat. So he wouldn't have rubbed shoulders with these people. But happenstance of history forced him to have to do that. It's a really touching tale, really great insight into Russian history. There are a number of great historical fiction novels based in Russia or on Russia that I recommend reading, but this is really just a brilliant book. And again, the setting is only in one hotel. Basically, the entire story takes place in this one hotel, but through newspaper, through flashbacks, through history, you learn so much about the historical context. Amor Towles is a great writer, and you explore all of these elements of history that you can explore in a historical novel, which sometimes in the older versions of historical novels would be in the battles and the politics. You explore through the idiosyncrasies and the nuances of one character and one mind, which I think is just absolutely beautiful. A great transition between historical fiction and literary fiction. A Gentleman in Moscow is the third one on this list here today. The fourth one is another work of Russian historical fiction. This one is a bit denser, I would say, a bit bigger. Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman, which is the one we're currently reading right in my book club right now, and I'm about halfway through this. I have actually gone a bit further than I need to, so I'm almost done. But this book here is really, really, really mind-boggling in terms of its scope. If you've ever read like War and Peace or Les Misérables or some of these big stories that seem to have such an expansive element of human history, this is like this for the 21st century, for Russia in the Stalinist era. If I would describe it in one sentence, I would say it's a portrait of the Battle of Stalingrad, but really it's a portrait through hundreds of characters. And sometimes a character is just explored for a couple of pages. It's all you get in their entire life, and you get more out of those couple pages than you might in entire novels. Grossman is unbelievable as a writer in terms of his profound insight into human nature, his exploration of freedom and totalitarianism, and what it means to remain human. There's a uniquely Russian aspect. It's like the Russian character, the Russian experience that this novel explores, but it also explores the human experience mitigated through the Russians. And I think that's so cool. Life and Fate, really, really wonderful historical work. A little bit more about Grossman before I wrap up this one. He was a war correspondent. He was one of the first journalists to be able to document the atrocities of the Holocaust after they happened, actually. So his writing on that is also, of course, absolutely worth reading. But this book in particular, it was a sequel to Stalingrad, which, because Stalingrad, his first book, wasn't so critical of the Soviet regime, it was allowed to exist. And this book was confiscated by the KGB. The manuscript was arrested rather than Grossman because they recognized Grossman to be a genius and a great writer and a great Russian, for whatever that meant to them at that time. But his manuscript was too dangerous. It had too many criticisms of the Russian regime. It did not favorably enough view communism. And for that reason, it wasn't allowed to be published. And obviously this book did make it out, and we were able to now read it. There's a few passages through it that we don't know exactly what he would have said because it didn't get past the censors, or it was lost. But we have almost everything that we need of Life and Fate, and Robert Chandler did a wonderful job of translating this for those of us who can't read Russian. Highly recommend checking this out. One of the greatest novels written about the Second World War, sometimes called the Soviet War and Peace, Life and Fate. Next one I have on this list is Les Misérables. Now, this one maybe wouldn't always be considered a work of historical fiction. I'm going to put it in this category. What do we even mean by a work of historical fiction, right? It's like almost anything could be a work of historical fiction. I was thinking I just have right here, well, a couple books down. It's okay. He survived. We have The Great Gatsby as an example. Like, is this historical fiction? I would categorize it more as literary fiction, even though technically it takes place in history, so it could be historical fiction. We're going to place Les Miserables as historical fiction because it takes place at an important time in history, and you do get a lot of insight into previous acts of history. This is one of the things that Victor Hugo loves to do. He'll do tangents where he'll go and talk about a sweeping historical battle that has very little relevance to the story, but it'll give you a deep historical insight to the Battle of Waterloo or whatnot. And because of this, you do get a certain ambience of the history, and you get a depth into the history around it. And so I very much think that qualifies as a historical fiction. It was published in 1862. The story is about the great Jean Valjean, one of the most amazing redemption stories ever written. And he's arrested. He's in prison for stealing a loaf of bread. And he basically, through chance and history and divine providence, he gets out. He's able to rebuild his own life, but he's still hunted by the laws of justice, represented by the great character Javert, as well as by many other great cast of characters, his daughter, his son-in-law, great revolutionaries, the kind of a lot of terrible characters that we have exposed to as well. But the story is this epic mediation on what does it mean to redeem oneself? What does it mean to have mercy? What does it mean to fight in a revolution? What is the true character of redemption? All of these questions are explored in Les Mis and so much more. Wonderful story. There's a great musical based on it as well. I love the musical. I grew up on the musical, but I also grew up on the story, and it's one of my personal favorite novels of all time, so I had to include this. I think Hugo spent over 20 years writing this novel. So it's his epic. It's his great work. But he's got other ones that are definitely worth reading. Notre Dame de Paris, or The Hunchback of Notre Dame, that's another one. The Man Who Laughs. But this book is really head and shoulders above his other works, in my opinion. It's set against the backdrop of after the Napoleonic era in France, 1832 Paris uprisings. So you get this really interesting kind of time period in history where you get to explore and learn so much about revolutions and rise and fall of different orders and different civilizations. Again, one of the great redemption stories, one of the great influences on modern literature. Highly, highly recommend reading it. Next one is A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, 1859. Now, of course, we have to talk about A Tale of Two Cities. This is one of the great works of historical fiction. I wouldn't say it's my favorite Dickens work, although I've talked about it a number of times in this channel, just because it's fit more into the thematic concepts and structures that I've been trying to articulate or to talk about. He's got a lot of other great works. I'll hopefully be able to do a whole video on Dickens at one point, but A Tale of Two Cities is a really accessible story from Dickens. You know, I always recommend it as one of the first great Dickens books for somebody to read. It feels a little different than some of his other stories, but it's nonstop. It goes. The summary is basically you have the French Revolution, and you have a bunch of characters in two different cities, in London and Paris, that are dealing with the fallout of the French Revolution. And it's a tale of sacrifice and love and loss and challenge amidst all of this chaos and topsy-turviness of everything that's happening at that time and period in history. Really well written. It was his best-selling book during his lifetime, and probably is today still his best-selling book. I think I was looking at this. Now, of course, these types of lists are not entirely definitive, but this is one of the greatest selling books of all time. It sold like hundreds of millions of copies. It's definitely top 10. And it has one of the great opening sentences in English literature. So it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Explores the necessity of love and forgiveness and questions the necessity of things like revolution and social change. And because of that, it's it's just one of the greatest stories and one of the great redemption stories as well, kind of in the same vein as Les Miserables. The seventh and final book on this list is The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Published in 1850, this is an American one. It's a Puritan New England setting, which I love. The Puritans, very compelling period of history, very compelling worldview. I'm not saying compelling in the sense that like I agree with them. I don't think of myself as particularly Puritan, although I guess we are all Puritan in some ways because they had a deep and lasting influence on many of the institutions that built the United States and subsequently Canada as well, educationally and whatnot. But the story is one woman and her kind of the physical exposure of her for sin and for her public shame and guilt, sin, and then also the man and his lack of that same experience. It's I don't know if that was like a really bad explanation of the plot, but basically when you read Hawthorne, what you're going to get is you're going to get a deep moral exploration in the nature of shame and guilt and adultery and questions of how one ought to live, how one ought to be shamed or not shamed if one has done something wrong, the inequality between how women are treated and men are treated, and wonderful, beautiful prose as you're reading that. It's got wonderful symbolism as well. The Scarlet Letter being an A for adultery, and it's set again in the kind of 17th century colony Massachusetts, so it's amazing. I think Hawthorne himself was descended from one of the Salem witch trial judges, or he has some sort of connection there. I'd have to double check exactly what that connection is, but I think it's like his one of his ancestors was involved with the Salem witch trials, which is really interesting. Kind of brings that. And again, this Scarlet A is one of the great symbols of literature, and almost like the white whale in Moby Dick and the Scarlet A in the Scarlet Letter. These are some of the greatest symbols in literature, and really helped to shape the American literary tradition. This is one novel that isn't talked about as much, but really should be considered one of the contenders for the great American novel. Anyways, that is the end of my list of the ones I've read and I love. My historical fiction to be read list is much longer, and I'm going to go through it quickly here. The first one is War and Peace by Lev Tolstoy. I've read portions of this, but I have not read it in its entirety. Again, it takes kind of the Napoleonic Wars in Russia. It's an epic story. Seems very fascinating. Again, hundreds of characters. I only read a small portion of this. I want to read it all. Second one is Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. I want to read this. It's about Cromwell, and again, it's fascinating time periods. I think I'm very interested in. I guess it's a reimagining of that, but it seems interesting. Third one is I, Claudius by Robert Graves. This is set in ancient Rome, the Caesars. It's about one of Rome's most unlikely emperors, an autobiography, so I thought that one, again, I have to read that. The Leopard. This is one that I really, really need to read. The Leopard is set in Sicily during the unification of Italy, and it's often called Italy's greatest historical novel. It's one that I've been meaning to read for a long time. I definitely want to, talk about political novels, and this is one of the ones that would be in that category. Another one is The Name of the Rose. I mentioned this before by Umberto Eco as one of the ones I want to read in the mystery genre. It's this kind of medieval monastery set mystery story. A lot of theology and philosophy and questions and books, and seems like very much up my alley. Definitely one I want to read. If Lonesome Dove can be considered as a historical fiction work, that's one I have to read. Absolutely. American West. It's one that everyone tells me I gotta read. Shogun. This is probably maybe the top one on the list after War and Peace is up there as well, but Shogun is one I've been wanting to read for so long. I've heard so many great things about it. It's kind of an east-west cultural meeting situation. The First English Samurai. Fascinating. Love it. And so many more. 1,000 Autumns of Jacob de Zoet by David Mitchell. I love David Mitchell. It's another one, Dutch Trading in Japan. It's one I've been meaning to read for a long time. Master and Commander by Patrick O'Brien. The Napoleonic Wars, another setting. Again, a lot of these are set in the Napoleonic Wars, but it's another big one. There you have it. Historical fiction is one of those genres that I feel like I really just kind of touched on, scratched the surface. The ones I have read have been impactful, the 3 kind of more modern ones and the 4 older ones as well. But every time I read one of these novels, I just feel that 5 or 10 more come to the surface that I need to read. So it's a faster growing list than I'm able to keep up with it, but I would love, nonetheless, to hear your recommendations. What do you guys think the greatest historical novels ever written are? Which book on my TBR are the ones I recommended you think I should prioritize as my next read or my first read? And what masterpiece do you feel that was left off of this list? And I am really excited to see some of your comments. If you enjoy this video, if you find value from this, if you like it, I'd appreciate you subscribing and joining the community here, of course. We'd love to have you for future videos, and I hope to see you in the next one. Until then, happy reading and take care.